Hi everyone, welcome. Thanks for joining us. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Professor Francisco Ferreira, who is the Amartya Professor of Inequality Studies at the International Inequalities. He is also the director of the International Inequalities Institute. He's an economist working on measurement causes and consequences of inequality and poverty in developing countries. And his work has been published widely, and has been awarded various prizes, including the Stone Prize like the Metrics and the Kenny Prize from the National Association for Research on Development. He is a non-resident research fellow at PITSA and an emeritus fellow at Stone Centers at City University of New York and the University of Chicago. He's a past president of the Latin American and Caribbean Economic Association, former editor-in-chief of the Journal of Economic Inequality, and currently serves on the UN University Council. Prior to joining the London School of Economics, Francisco had a long career at the World Bank, holding positions including economist for the African region and senior advisor in the region. He has also worked in the Faculty of Economics at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Rio de Janeiro and in the High School of Economics. I was born and raised in Sao Paulo and got a PhD in economics from the LACIR. So we're very, very pleased to have him with us this talk. He's presenting on findings from the Latin American and Caribbean Inequality Review. And this is directly relevant for us because we're about to start with the African Inequality Review, where Professor Ferreira is also one of the expert members of that. So, to some extent, our African Inequality Review is going to be shaped by and modeled after this is going to be. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Professor Ferreira.
So thank you for the opportunity. As Vimal said, I think this is a talk about the Latin American and Caribbean Inequality Review. And I think the subject is of particular interest today in that it may inform something about what's going on with the African Inequality Review, which we're about to launch very soon. And we have Murray Librand connected here, who's the sort of main figure leading that effort. And the African Inequality Review is to some extent inspired by, I think, the Deaton Review of Inequality here in the UK and LACIR, the Latin American Inequality Review. So as this slide here says, let me see if I can use this pointer. The work that we started in 2020 or 2021 was itself inspired by this Deaton Review, which was led obviously by Angus Deaton, Nobel laureate in economics, where they convened a panel based at the Institute for Fiscal Studies here in London to try and understand and take a broad view and understand the big picture of inequality in all its aspects and manifestations in the UK. And then eventually they extended that actually to other advanced countries. And some members of that panel then reached out to a number of us about doing something similar for Latin America. So the idea was, it says here, an independent scholarly endeavor that wanted to try and understand why, despite major reforms and a certain amount of economic growth and considerable political aversion to inequality, why is inequality in Latin America so persistent, and why does it persist at such high levels? So this presentation today is a little funny in that the first part I'll go actually through the making of the movie, if you like, through how LACIR worked, which I normally don't do, but I'm doing that today just because I think in the context of the nascent African Inequality Review, it may be useful to just recap how LACIR worked. And then in the second part, I'll actually launch into the main conclusions that we have from LACIR. So the work of this review was overseen by a panel of experts, much as in the case of the African review. We had 15 members, and it was structured in two phases. These are the sponsoring institutions here. So the work was overseen by this panel, but it was sponsored by these four institutions, which had members, people working in these places. Yale, LSE, IDB, and the IFS were on the panel as well. So phase one was basically about stock taking of inequality in Latin America and some original research, leading to a number of papers, 28 papers, which were ultimately eventually published in a special issue of this open access journal called Oxford Open Economics, which is also where the Deaton Review papers were published. So the Deaton Review papers were published in volume 3, I think, of Oxford Open Economics, and our review was published in volume 4. Along the way, this took 4 or 5 years between the launch of the review and the publication of that special issue. 4 years, I should say. Along the way, we had 2 dedicated conferences, meaning conferences of the LACIR group, one at which people presented abstracts and initial ideas for the papers, and there was a lot of feedback, and a final one in which the final papers were presented. And along the way, there were a set of online seminars within each specific theme, and often we would take advantage of special sessions in relevant conferences like that of the Latin American and Caribbean Economic Association, or ECINEC, the Society for the Study of Economic Inequality, or other conferences like that, at which we would present ongoing work or early findings, get feedback from people, so on. There was also quite a lot of engagement with the policy world through both the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies here in London, but also and primarily through the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank, which actually had a podcast series with 10 or 11 episodes, with different authors of the review. So here's the panel. I guess that's not too great importance, but here are the first 8 members. The panel intended to be interdisciplinary, and Anna is a political scientist at Yale. Florencia is a sociologist at Stanford, but I must admit the rest of us, I'm afraid, we're all economists, and that's the other 7. And here at the corner were some of the young people who worked with us in the beginning. It's actually missing our current project coordinator, Danielle Alves, whose picture should be here, but there you go. That's the picture I had. So that was the panel. And the first thing the panel did, how did it work? So these 15 people sat around their screens. This was still in the pandemic. And we were trying to figure out, okay, how do we structure an inquiry into something as broad as this theme of inequality in Latin America, right? So conversation with these experts led to the organization of the space of inquiry, if you like, the thematic subject matter, into 5 groups of subjects, so 5 broad themes which are listed here. The first was about establishing the facts. So the first was about trying to assess what we knew and didn't know about levels and trends of inequality and not just in income, but also looking at other dimensions like wealth, land, education, health. You'll see the resulting papers in a moment. Then the next 3, if you like, look at sort of stylized life cycle, if you like, and how different institutions along the life cycle contribute to inequality. So the first one, which was called Inequality of Opportunity, looked at the role of families, communities, the places where people are born and grow up, the schools they go to, so the sort of pre-labor market foundations of inequality and how these institutions contribute to inequality. The third team then look at the role of markets, and in particular, the labor market. I mean, we did also have some things on capital and goods markets, but the whole focus was on labor markets and how that these workers that are coming out from this process here, people are brought up by their families, they go to school, they bring their human capital to the market. The market has its own characteristics. It has, you know, different degrees of market power and so on, and how does that work? Theme 4 looked at the role of the state, so taxation and redistribution, and what the government did or didn't do to affect the distribution of income. And the fifth theme, which was kind of more overarching, looked at the role of governance, of political power, and inequality in politics, if you like. So structures and struggles there has to do with assessing the relationship between inequality and political power. So those were the 5 themes, and that then led to a set of 28 papers. So once the panel selected these themes, the next thing the panel did was to say, okay, within each of these themes, and given that there's a budget constraint and a limit on the resources available to this exercise, what papers should we commission? And so this is actually a process that the African Inequality Review is undergoing at the moment. The panel in that review is in the process now of trying to decide what papers should be commissioned. And this is what we ended up with. And I just pasted here the titles and authors of the papers as published in that special issue of Oxford Open Economics. So we had an editorial with the 5 members of the steering committee of the panel, which is kind of a summary, if you like, of the whole thing. And then in the first theme on levels and trends and inequality, we had a paper on income and consumption, a paper on wealth, a paper on farm size and income distribution in agriculture, a paper on educational inequalities, and a paper on health inequalities. In the inequality of opportunity part, in the nature and determinants, we had a paper, a sort of overall paper on intergenerational persistence and inequality of opportunity, trying to measure the extent of inequality of opportunity in the region. And then we had a paper looking at the early years, early childhood, and its role in contributing to inequality in human capital that opens up already very early. A paper on demographics and family changes, paper on gender, paper on racial inequality, and on spatial inequality. In the labor market themes, we looked at firms. This is a paper really describing the distribution of firms and the characteristics of firms in the region. A paper on market power, so the interaction of those firms in the goods market and what it did in terms of market power, actually in the labor market as well. So this was market power both in the output market and the goods market, and their monopsony power in the labor market. Paper on trade. So this globalization inequality is largely to do with the whole question of openness and trade and what that did to inequality in wages in the latest, the last 20 to 30 years. And then 2 papers on labor market institutions. One looking at minimum wage policies, which are quite prevalent in the region, and the other looking at labor market turnover and inequality. Looking at the role of the state, we had a couple of papers on taxation. So these first 2 are on taxation and subsidies as well. One on cash transfers that looked not only at inequality, but also at poverty. One on the redistributive impact of pension systems. One on the role of health systems. We had earlier a paper in the facts, in the establishing the facts part, we had a paper on health inequalities. This looks at the role of differences across the continent in health systems and the implications of that for the health outcomes that we see in the distribution of those health outcomes. And a paper on preferences for redistribution in Latin America. Okay. And then in the last theme, the political power theme, we had a historical chapter that looked at the origins of Latin American inequality going back to the colonial times. A paper on the interaction of economic and political inequality with Jim Robinson, another Nobel laureate, and his co-authors. A paper on the political economy of redistribution specifically, and a paper on the social contract in Latin America and the phenomenon of elites opting out of public services and the implications of that for the funding of public services in the region. So that was phase one. And phase two of the review, which I think is also envisaged for AIR, for the African review, is to take the quite rich range of findings from all of those different studies, which are quite detailed. I mean, there are more than 1,000 pages of findings from all of those different papers, and try and synthesize them in a coherent story in a short volume of 100, 150 pages in non-technical language for a broader audience. So this is the part where we're still working at the moment. So the phase one is completed for LACIR, but we're currently working now. We have drafts of the 7 chapters for the book. We are, I think, almost about to sign the contract with a publisher, and we hope that within the next 10 to 12 months we'll have the book out. So what I want to do now, if you're still awake, is to try and actually give you the synthesis that we're a version of the synthesis, so a short presentation on this synthesis that we're trying to do. So obviously I couldn't go through the 28 papers, right? But the idea is, okay, what can we bring out together in the end from that whole exercise? And our synthesis volume is structured around this idea of 2 systems of inequality reproduction in Latin America and the Caribbean. As it says there, these are sort of heroically considerations drawing on much richer material. Okay, so what's our story there? Well, our story has 3 parts. The first one, which obviously draws on those first 5 papers from the establishing the facts, is on the nature of inequality in Latin America. And even there, of course, there's an enormous amount of detail and nuance that can be presented, but in a short space of time and in the synthesis volume, what we say about the nature of inequality in Latin America is basically 3 things. The first is that it is high. Inequalities in Latin America are high. This is not surprising. Here are trends from World Bank data, largely. Are trends in Gini coefficients. So these are within country Gini coefficients in different regions of the world from 1990 to 2020. Here are the industrialized countries. So when we hear about all the outrage about inequality in the United States and so on, well, that's obviously higher than this, but it's in this average here. Here's Africa and here's Latin America. We emphasize, and so our point here is that inequality in Latin America is extremely high. We actually always emphasize that it's very difficult to compare inequality in Africa and Latin America because all of the Gini coefficients here at this kind of 50 range are based on income distributions, whereas in Africa, they're based on a mix, but primarily on consumption distributions, although there's some income number there as well. And obviously consumption inequality is lower than the corresponding income inequality because rich people save more than poor. And so when you actually try to compare these 2 and adjust for what the differences might be, it looks very close. And it looks, in fact, like Africa may sometimes have a higher inequality than Latin America. And Southern Africa, of course, where you are, certainly does, South Africa in particular, but also Namibia. In any case, these two continents are the most unequal in the world. That's relatively certain. And so inequality in Latin America is high and has been persistently high, although there's been a decline here, as you can see, but it has been persistently high. In the detail, we emphasize that actually there's considerable uncertainty about exact levels. So here are, single time series, a single line with a summary of inequality in the region. But if you dig below that, not only are there many countries, obviously, and we had in this first chapter, we looked at 18 countries. These are the first 9. But what I'm showing here is what we call inequality bands. So what we did is we collected 5,600 estimates of inequality from the 1950s. 1948 was the first one to 2021. And we found wide ranges of estimates for a single year in a single country. Okay. So if you look, for example, here at Brazil, already in 1960, but still to this day, we have for the same years estimates that range from the high 40s to 70. This is an incredible amount of uncertainty. And it's driven primarily by the fact that people are calculating inequality in different things. These very high estimates here, for example, are based on the Piketty et al. Estimates that distribute national accounts income to households, where these are primarily based on surveys, right? Some of these are based on taxes. Even when they're based on surveys, they may be pre or post tax, and they may be equivalized or per capita. There's an enormous amount of uncertainty and sources of differences which this chapter explores. So just how high is a matter of considerable disagreement still. And the review is actually quite explicit about what we know and what we don't know, and the degree of uncertainty or disagreement in the literature. Okay. But inequalities in Latin America are, regardless of these bands here, they are high. They're also multifaceted and interconnected, meaning they're not on a single dimension, and the dimensions are connected. So over here, what we've got are estimates of stunting rates. So children 0 to 5, this is their height for age. Okay, this is the share of 0 to 5-year-olds in each of these countries whose height for age is below -2 standard deviations from the median of a reference group. And in each country, instead of having just the country, we calculate the stunting rates for each quintile of a wealth distribution based on DHS asset indices and so on. So, and this red line here is the OECD average. Here's the Latin American average. So to begin with, we see that stunting is considerably more prevalent in Latin America than it is in the OECD. But there are two kinds of inequalities that jump at you here, right? One is between countries. So if you look, for example, at the Dominican Republic or Cuba or Barbados, these countries have stunting rates very close to the OECD average. Whereas, of course, Guatemala, Bolivia, Haiti have much higher levels of stunting than the OECD or than the Latin American average. And the second kind of inequality is within countries, right? That's between countries, but within countries, we see that, for example, if you look at Bolivia, the highest quintile in Bolivia has a stunting rate similar to the OECD average, whereas the poorest has about 9 times as much stunting. And the gradients aren't always the same, but the gradients tend to be that children in richer households have much less stunting than children in poorer households, which is the interconnection, right? So there are gradients here in health inequalities. There are health inequalities, and they are correlated with income inequalities. And similar patterns can be seen with education and so on, okay? And the third, so they're high, they're multifaceted and interconnected, and thirdly, they have an important horizontal component, that is a component that is between groups, right? We look mostly, economists tend to look at inequality across the distributions of individuals or households, but group identity matters, of course, as we know. I don't need to tell South Africans that group identity matters. Here is mean per capita household income by ethno-racial group and skin color using this survey, LAPOP, and in 3, 6, I don't know, in a number of Latin American countries, and the darker colors and the dots. So 0% is category 5, which is one of the sort of brown skin categories, if you like. And these are percentage differences from that category for the whiter groups and for the darker groups, which in many countries will be Black, African, Latin American, Afro-Latin Americans. But there are also a lot of indigenous groups and so on. So you see the pattern here that color of skin and racial background is highly predictive of income in the region. And there are similar differences across other characteristics like gender. So inequality is high. It's across many dimensions. They are interrelated. Group-based differences matter. Why do these inequalities persist? Why is this equilibrium been around for so long? This clearly reflects our history of slavery and colonial conquest. Why is it that 200 years on, this is still like that? So we tended to think, on the basis of the evidence that we assembled for this review, that there is actually not one, but two interrelated systems of inequality reproduction here going on. And they sort of feed on each other. And the first one we call the short cycle is one that's basically a sort of in the time scope of a lifetime. Okay. And this is a story of advantage and disadvantage accumulation over the course of the life cycle. So from the paper on early childhood, we find some evidence that not in every country, but in many countries, differences in mental development, measured here by vocabulary and cognition, right, open up very quickly, even in children age 0 to 5, across quartiles of the distribution. So the way you'd read this, if you just forget these numbers here, but we look at these dots and confidence intervals, say for urban Colombia, this is urban Colombia, rural Colombia, is with reference to quartile 1, which is normalized to 0 here in this line, right? What are these standardized differences in vocabulary recognition for quartile 2, quartile 3, and quartile 4? So you see these gaps opening up quite markedly in even what children understand and the vocabularies that they have before they've gotten to school at all. So this is to age 5, and you see these gaps in Colombia and Peru. You don't really see them in Uruguay and Chile. This is the vocabulary results. These are measures for cognition. The story is reasonably similar. In Peru and Colombia, you have these gaps opening up very much. In Uruguay and Chile, which are, Uruguay is a less unequal country in income terms. Chile is still quite unequal in income terms, but clearly does something that prevent this from happening quite as much. Okay, so these gaps in cognitive ability, if you like, open up before people even get to school. But when they get to school, these gaps are amplified, and they're amplified both in terms of quantity and of quality or learning ability. Here we have some data for quantity of learning, and let me explain what this graph does. If we look here at Brazil, here we have the probability of finishing university, okay, for three categories. So the base category is if neither of your parents has finished upper secondary. If neither of your parents have finished upper secondary, you have a 15% chance of finishing university. If one of your parents at least has finished upper secondary, that goes up 15 plus 30 to 45%. And if one of your parents has actually finished university, him or herself, then it goes up, by 70 percentage points, so 85%. So the persistence is there, right? If you've got a parent that went to university, you're much more likely to finish university than if neither of your parents did. And upper secondary also matters. And these gaps, these are upper middle income countries in Latin America. This is Chile, which is a high income country in Latin America. These are comparators. Other regions. You see that these gaps exist in other regions too, but they're less pronounced in places like Korea and Spain and Turkey than they are not Turkey, Spain and Korea than they are here. But these gaps exist everywhere, and they're clearly very marked in Latin America as well. Okay, so things are happening in families. There's already gaps in cognition. Schools amplify those, and we have lots of other evidence on learning as well. I'm just giving you quantity of education here, completing tertiary, but there's a lot more detail in the analysis, right? Then people come to the labor market. And here the story is kind of summarized, I think, best by this title here, where what happens is that unequally skilled workers meet unequally productive firms. Okay. We don't observe the distribution of productivity by firm because, amongst other things, it would be productivity of what? Labor, capital, total factor, right? So a pretty good proxy, though, is firm size. So let me explain this kind of busy graphs over here. This on the left here, we've got the distribution of workers by the size of firm, just in three categories. These are self-employed workers. One worker. This is less than 10 workers. And this is more than 11 or more. Okay. And each of these colors here is a part of the world. Latin America is the first. And then let's just focus on one. Let's take France. Okay. We always take the US. Let's take France, which is the third one. Okay. So what you want to understand is that in France, or indeed any of these other places, these are advanced economies, right? US, France, EU, and high-income Asia. A minority of workers are self-employed, 7 to 12%. Then there are a few people working in small firms. Most workers work in big firms, or at least medium firms, 10 workers or more. It's not very big. But in Latin America, that's not the case at all. It's about a third each. 32%, 36%, 32%. So we've got a distribution that is skewed to small firms and particularly skewed to self-employment. Why does that matter? Because these are less productive firms that generate less earning. If we look at workers in this group and where they are in the distribution of income, so these are the 10 tenths or deciles, to use the misnomer, 10 deciles of income distribution here, you see that 63% of the poorest decile come from these guys, whereas 54% of the top decile comes from these guys. Okay, and there's a very wide range of productivity across massive multinationals or homegrown companies across Latin America, which are large and well developed, and examples of informal self-employment that you see in the streets of our cities, which you would also see, for example, in townships in South Africa, and even much more in other parts of Africa. But in Latin America, that's the story there. So you've got those differences in human capital and education and productive potential that come from the family and school system meets the labor market. Workers sort so that the more educated and more productive ones end up in the more productive firms, and the ones which are least productive end up in the less productive firms, and you generate a distribution of earnings and wages which is very unequal, and which we could summarize in many ways. Here we just compare average skill premia from completing upper secondary or tertiary university education relative to not completing at least upper secondary. So 0 would be not completing upper secondary. Before, when we looked at this, it was about parents, right? Now we're looking at the worker's own education. So this is the worker's own education. And what it's telling you is on average in Latin America, across the countries we had data for, if you complete tertiary education, on average, you have 100% premium over the average wages of people who have not completed upper secondary. 30% if you complete upper secondary, 100% if you complete tertiary. And for the non-Latin American countries, which are the ones that we looked at here, so Turkey, Spain, Korea, and the US, it's obviously not the world, but it's these quite different 4 countries over here. They have, and notice that there's no sort of, no Sweden or Denmark or anything. These are not particularly egalitarian countries themselves. Korea is actually quite egalitarian, but the others are not, and much lower skill premium. So this is this sort of outcome, or at least one manifestation of the outcomes from that labor market meet between very unequally skilled workers and very unequally productive firms. But of course, as you well know, in South Africa, it's quite an active redistributor. The state can make a difference, right? The state can redistribute, state can tax and transfer. And yet what we find on average is that in Latin America, the state generally fails to redistribute. Not always. Tax systems are always progressive in Latin America, but the quantitative effect of moving from market to consumable income, and what we mean by consumable income here is it's disposable, but it's also after indirect taxes. So normally you think of disposable income of after taxes and transfers in cash, right? But this is also after indirect taxes, which are very important in the region, as I'll show you in a moment. And this right axis, there's nothing on this right axis because I took it away because it was too busy. The axis that matters here is this one, redistributive effect. So this is Gini points. So 0.05 means 5 Gini points. Right? This is the change in the Gini coefficient, the decline in the Gini coefficient as you move from market income to consumable. The 2 colors have to do with different treatments of contributory pensions, which is an important detail, but it's a detail for today. We don't have time to get into it. Let's just think of the blue one, for example. And here's the LAC average, and here is the United States and Spain. So whereas in Spain, depending on how you treat contributory pensions, the difference between the market distribution of income and the post taxes and transfers, the secondary distribution of income, disposable income, is, somewhere around 15 percentage points, 15 Gini points. Whereas in Latin America, the difference is less than 5 Gini points, somewhere around 3 Gini points. So the state does not redistribute as much as even in the US, for example, or even in middle income countries that are not Latin America. Missing a slide, but on the other hand, also missing time. So let's skip the slide I'm missing. This is a sort of summary of this. So you've got this life cycle story here where, families, schools, markets, the state, what we've got here is we've got a relationship between inequality of opportunity, which you should think of as the share of inequality that's explained, that's inherited, share of inequality that is due to circumstances that people inherit, like their parents' education, their parents' occupation, the place where they were born, their race, and gender. Okay? So it's like the inverse of intergenerational mobility in some sense. And here is initial inequality in the Gini coefficient. And this positive association is telling, oh, here, by the way, is South Africa. Sorry to tell you. So with the highest level of inequality and the highest level of that share of that inequality, which is inherited. South Africa is the only country. When I present this in Latin America, I say, look, if you want to feel good about Latin America, you have to just compare it to South Africa. But anywhere else, we're doing really terribly. These orange dots over here. Okay, but India is nearby, Uganda, China is here, but certainly a lot less well than even the United States, which is the most unequal of the rich countries, and all of Europe and Australia, Korea, and so on are down here. This association has a name that many of you will probably know. If we had the inverse of intergenerational mobility here, which is a closely related concept, then this would be called the Great Gatsby curve, right? Which Miles Korak and Alan Kruger called the Great Gatsby curve. And it tells you, in the words of an advisor to President Obama, it tells you that the further away are the steps, the harder is to climb the ladder. Right? So if initial inequalities are very large, they transmit over time into the opportunities of children, and that cycle repeats. So this is the short cycle. Okay? But of course, these institutions are not written in stone. The fact that the government behaves like this is an outcome of a political process, right? The fact that the schools fail to equalize opportunities, the fact that services do not redistribute as much as they could reflects some sort of social contract. And so that's where the short cycle interacts with this longer cycle. The long cycle is in a historical time dimension rather than a life cycle one. And we start in this part of the book by looking at just the correlations between some of the most extractive institutions during our colonial times, which in Latin America was basically slavery, right? So if we look at areas across different countries, these are subnational areas, regions across countries in Latin America, and we look at the percentage of their enslaved population in the 1800s, and we look at their Gini coefficients today, there's still a very strong relationship. Now, this is not causal in any ways, it's a correlation, although there is much evidence in the literature, as many of you will know, Melissa Dell's work and others, which look at extractive institutions from colonial times, often with indigenous peoples in the western side of the continent. This is more slaves in the eastern side of the continent, that find causal evidence as well that these very deeply extractive institutions are associated with persistent inequality today. And the sort of very stylized way of thinking about this is if you've got an economy in the 1600s, which is based on large plantation agriculture, where all of the land is owned by a small group of white Europeans, and most of the workers are actually slaves brought from Africa with absolutely no assets and no rights, even over the product of their labor, inevitably, you're going to have an enormous amount of inequality. And if we look at wealth inequality today, it's still very, very unequal. Right? Here, we have information for the only 3 countries for which our authors of this paper felt confident enough on the data to actually provide estimates like this. We have work for other countries, but these are the 3 countries with the best data, and in this case here, 4 countries. And this is the share of wealth held, not income, but wealth held by the top 1% in Uruguay, Colombia, and Chile, remarkably similar at around 40%. And these are the shares of the bottom 50%. So the top 1, bottom 50. And these are less than 10% in all cases. This is Chile and Uruguay here, Mexico. In Colombia, it can be even negative. If you worry about how wealth can be negative, it's because debts can be larger than your assets. But so the bottom half, this is a remarkable thing for Colombia. The bottom half of the population in Colombia has basically zero wealth. So, to some extent, these very deep roots of inequality persist today in unequal distributions of wealth, but also unequal distributions of political power. And the point is that power and wealth are associated. So here we've got a picture of a conquistador, a noble Spaniard born in 1523, who was the main Spanish conquistador of what is today Costa Rica in Central America. And what this historian Sam Stone did a long time ago is he tracked down the presidents and Congress people in Costa Rica who were direct descendants of this guy. Okay, so through various different branches of his family, he was married to Doña Isabel Arias Davila, and amongst their descendants, there are 31 presidents and 285 members of parliament, which is statistically not random, as you can imagine. So power also transmits over time, much as wealth does. And this generates an association, obviously, between wealth and power that can have effects on the institutions of governance in the region. One small outcome of which is a part that we think is an important part of the way the Latin American social contract works. And that is that you end up with what we call here this chasm between the elite and the majority, in which the elite pay low taxes, generally, not in all countries. Brazil and Argentina are exceptions, but they generally pay low taxes, producing low quality public services, but that doesn't matter to the elite because they opt out. So here are two graphs. Here we have the proportion of people in each decile of the distribution whose kids go to private school across Latin America. This is averages in selected countries in Latin America. And you see that the bottom, of course, cannot send their kids to private school because they can't afford them. But for the top decile, 70% or so of the kids go to private school. And here are the consequences of going to public school in terms of PISA scores, in terms of learning achievement in reading. So in Brazil, for example, if you go to a public school, you are likely to, your PISA score when you're 15 in reading is 100 points, which is a full standard deviation below those who go to private schools. And it's negative everywhere. In Latin America, ranging from the Brazilian extreme to Mexico and Chile, which are slightly less bad. But look at our comparator countries again. There's a little bit of that in Spain, but none in the US, Turkey, and Korea. Inegalitarian though the United States and Turkey may be, there is no private public school premium in learning, in reading at least, as there is in Latin America. So this mechanism of opting out of public services also has direct consequences to the persistence of inequalities today in human capital, in learning, and in earning potential. So this long cycle of inequality reproduction and lack is something that, this is not new. This has been known for a long time, and people like Engerman and Sokolov or Acemoglu and Robinson and many others have used it in different ways. But there's this interaction between economic inequality, inequality of power, and power helps shape the way governments and governance institutions work, and therefore the opportunities that will be available to different children across the distribution, which of course then feeds back into the persistent inequality. So here's kind of the long cycle, and here's the short cycle in some sense. So let me end there. I'll stop sharing, and I hope there's a little bit of time for questions. Thank you very much. Okay, so Rakuzzo Rukudzo, I think, sorry, Rukudzo Pamacheche asked the question, are there other considerations for, are there alternative motivations for pursuing university education apart from parents having gone to university? The pressure on job markets and high unemployment levels may push graduates to return to university until they find jobs. This is a reality in some African countries. This is a great question and a great example of why, it's important to do these reviews in different places differently, because I think the economic structures are different, even if there are many similarities across Africa and Latin America. So I've heard of a lot of graduate unemployment in parts of Africa, including South Africa, which I presume is some of what you're referring to here. In Latin America, actually, I think unemployment rates amongst university graduates are very low. Finding a job is much easier if you've gone to university. There may be some changes in that for people going to low quality new universities in some countries, but on the whole, it has not been an issue, unemployment amongst graduates. And it's not really about the parents having gone to university providing a motivation. More of the story is like this. You get into public university in Latin America, varies a bit across country, but in general, you get into public universities in Latin America, which are free, by passing an exam. And you pass that exam by having had very good secondary education. And very good secondary education, like I showed you, has to be private. So the way in which family background, family wealth affects going to university in Latin America is through access to high quality secondary education. Then they get free university education, which the poor don't get because they haven't got good secondary education. If you get the system, that's kind of how it works there. In Africa, I think it could be quite different, as you point out in your question, and I think we have to look forward to the inequality review in Africa to find out. Thanks.
Prof, can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, I can. Thank you.
Finally, thank you. Are there any questions in our room? Sorry, some people have had to leave because we usually end at 2. There's one other question here from Tim Conway in the chat.
Right, I'll take that one. So that Tim Conway says, can you say something about options for tackling inequality in the region? What explains the declines, albeit quite modest, since 2000? What was most important, alone or in combinations? Again, so that's a great question. Yes, so we've done not so much in the review per se, but many of us involved in the review had done work on this decline in Latin American inequality, primarily since 2000, in some cases, the mid to late 90s, up until around 2012, 2015. The microeconomic determinants of that were largely actually labor market driven. There had been increases in educational quantity in preceding decades. So the labor force was getting more schooled. Demand for skills were not rising, in part because of the commodity boom, which ended in 2012, which meant that most of the demand was not there wasn't a lot of increase in demand for skilled labor. So higher supply of skilled labor, no increase in demand for skilled labor, that wage premium that I showed you that was very, very high fell in most countries in the region. And that was the primary driver of inequality declines. A secondary driver, which was still important, but quantitatively less important, was the change in the welfare state or the redistributive apparatus of the state, particularly with the introduction of non-contributory pensions, as you have in South Africa, right? But in the introduction of non-contributory pensions and conditional cash transfers. So previously, all social assistance in Latin America had been associated with formal employment. If you had formal employment, you had right to unemployment insurance, pensions, and so on. But only the top half of the distribution of workers had access to formal employment. So the bottom of the distribution got nothing. These changes in redistribution were a second, but important factor in the decline. for inequality there. So let me leave it there.
Thanks, Prof. Anyone else? Well, I want to take the chance to thank you again. This has been really interesting. And I'm sure we'll meet you soon when you come for the African Inequality Review.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today. Thank you.
Yeah.